Fairy tales have long captivated audiences with their enchanting plots, magical creatures, and timeless lessons. However, behind these familiar stories, there are surprising facts that most people don't know. Here are 10 little-known facts about fairy tales that will make you look at them in a whole new light. 1. Many fairy tales have dark origins. The fairy tales we know today have often been sanitized over time. The original versions of stories like Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, and Hansel and Gretel were much darker and included gruesome details, such as murder, cannibalism, and even incest. For example, in the original Cinderella, the stepsisters try to deceive the prince by cutting off parts of their feet to fit into the glass slipper. These grim aspects were toned down in later retellings for children. 2. The brothers Grimm didn't write fairy tales. Although Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm are often credited with creating fairy tales, they were actually collectors, not writers. They compiled stories from oral tradition, and many of the tales existed long before the Grimms' time. The brothers aimed to preserve German folklore, not create new stories. Their collections, like Grimm's fairy tales, helped preserve these tales, but they didn't invent the stories themselves. 3. Cinderella has many versions. While Cinderella is widely recognized as the story of a girl mistreated by her stepfamily who gets help from a fairy godmother, this tale has appeared in numerous cultures with unique twists. For example, in the Chinese version called Yi Xian, Cinderella's fairy godmother is a magical fish, and the girl's slipper is made from gold, not glass. Different cultures have adapted the basic elements of the story in their own ways. 4. The first fairy tale was written in the 17th century. Although fairy tales have been passed down orally for generations, the first written fairy tales emerged in the 17th century. French author Charles Perrault is often credited with popularizing the genre, thanks to works like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Little Red Riding Hood. These stories were originally written for the French aristocracy, but soon gained popularity with broader audiences. 5. Fairy tales often teach moral lessons. One of the reasons fairy tales have endured for centuries is their ability to teach valuable life lessons. Many of these stories emphasize virtues such as kindness, bravery, and honesty. However, they also impart warnings against greed, vanity, and selfishness. In The Ugly Duckling, for example, the story teaches that inner beauty will eventually shine through, while in The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the moral is about the consequences of dishonesty. 6. Some fairy tales are based on real events. Some of the most famous fairy tales were inspired by real-life events or historical figures. For example, the story of Rapunzel might have been inspired by a real girl in Italy in the 16th century who was locked away in a tower by her parents. Similarly, the Pied Piper of Hamelin is thought to be based on a real incident in which children disappeared after a piper led him away, possibly due to a plague or migration. 7. Fairy tales have evolved over time. Fairy tales have evolved significantly over the centuries. The earliest versions of stories were often much more adult in content, as fairy tales were originally told by adults to adults. As they became more widely shared, particularly through the rise of children's literature in the 19th and 20th centuries, fairy tales were rewritten with child-friendly elements, removing much of their earlier dark or violent content. 8. Fairy tales were once oral performances. Before being written down, fairy tales were often told through oral storytelling. These performances were an important form of entertainment and education for people, especially in the pre-printing press era. Storytellers would often add their own flair to the tales, making each retelling slightly different from the last. This contributed to the fluidity of fairy tales, allowing them to adapt to different cultures and generations. 9. Fairy tales can have hidden meanings. Many fairy tales contain layers of symbolism and deeper meanings that are not immediately obvious. For example, in Beauty and the Beast represents the idea that love can overcome superficial judgments. In The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen's original version explores themes of sacrifice, unrequited love, and the longing for an eternal soul, which adds a melancholic depth to what seems like a simple love story. 10. The fairy tale genre is still evolving. Although fairy tales are rooted in ancient folklore, they continue to inspire modern works of fiction. Today, many writers, filmmakers, and artists are putting new spins on classic fairy tales. Movies like Frozen, Maleficent, and books like The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Mayer show how fairy tale elements can be reinvented for modern audiences, blending fantasy with contemporary themes. Fairy tales are not just charming stories for children, They are rich with history, complex messages, and cultural significance. From their darker roots to their evolution into modern narratives, fairy tales continue to captivate, surprise, and inspire audiences worldwide.